This video is brought to you by Squarespace. When you think of puppetry, I'm sure the first thing that comes to mind is either a Pinocchio-like puppet or those hand puppets your therapist makes you use to talk about your issues.
It's puppet therapy.
But in fact, modern puppetry is incredibly complex and requires a good bit of engineering and creativity. And when done well, you sit there thinking, man, this CGI work looks so realistic. In today's video, we're going to be talking with Paul Lewis, a puppeteer that worked on movies like Megan, about his work on Netflix's Sweet Tooth, where they have developed some incredibly complex and amazing puppets, and how utilizing puppets well can cut down on VFX work and even be way more convincing. So take off a sock, make it a puppet, and let's learn a thing or two about puppetry.
I just wanna have fun, clap my hands, turn around now and dance, dance, dance. I just wanna have fun, clap my hands, turn around now and dance, dance, dance.
But there is something to be said about taking something older, reinventing it to be something more than anyone originally thought that it could be. And that's what our sponsor Squarespace did with their next generation Fluid Engine. Fluid Engine gives you access to limitless customization, adding support for actions like adding, moving, and changing site elements, plus other design settings for desktop and mobile. This is a perfect feature for us creatives who really want to show off our personality, of our content, and our brand, and don't like being confined to limited creative options. So if you're looking to build a new website or update your old one, try out this amazing new system today. Head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/FrameVoyager to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Sweet Tooth is a Netflix show that was developed by Jim Mickle based off of a DC comic book, and it's set in a fictional world where a virus has taken out most of a good chunk of the population. But unlike a typical dystopian story, this one is a bit of a twist. Children being born around the time of the virus were born both part human and part animal, and it's an intriguing concept for a show and one that makes a lot of sense to use puppetry in.
I worked for a studio called Woe Studios, and their venture was set up so that they would do live theatre shows. So I built a puppet to audition with and went along and got cast as the lead character in this, and it turned out to be a full-time gig. And it was wonderful. So I spent 4.5 years there and just working full-time as a puppeteer and got into puppet making there as well. And my puppets were used in the shows. So I sort of reached a point where the standard of my building was high enough that the boss was like, yeah, let's start using your characters. One of the producers of the Custer's World TV show, Mel Turner, also produced Sweet Tooth. And she brought all of us on for the pilot of Sweet Tooth to do a scene in a hospital where there's all these little hybrid babies, and they were all puppets. So we all performed one of the characters each, and I was brought back to be a puppeteer on Bobby, and that's where it started. And it kicked off from there. And then for season 2, I was handed the reins as lead puppeteer for Bobby. And so I looked after his performance. Yeah, and it wasn't just Bobby on season 2 as well. There were other characters I puppeteered too.
One of the more interesting points Paul mentioned while working on Sweet Tooth was how closely they worked with the VFX team to make sure their post-production work would be as minimal as possible, which is a great thing to see, especially considering a lot of directors just kind of throw in green screen and think that makes it easy on VFX artists.
We had VFX there working with us all the time on set, because with Bobby, you got 2 people physically on set with him. We started out in blue screen suits and then changed to grey when VFX finally realized that the blue was actually creating problems for them. So grey is actually a better color to use, particularly in a multi-colored set where there's lots of complicated textures like trees and so forth. So VFX were always there to say, oh guys, are you able to like scooch around a couple of inches further to your left or to your right? That'll just help us with what's behind you when we eventually paint you out. Or guys, you're accidentally brushing one of the trees near you. Can you just kind of bring in your elbows a little bit more when you're performing? So yeah, there was that kind of collaboration constantly happening. As much as possible, planned ahead. So we do like little previs videos of what we thought we could do for Bobby's performance in each scene. And then we would send that to the director of the episode, to Jim as well, the showrunner, Jim Mickle, and also Matt Bramante, the head of VFX, and just get their feedback and just say, well, this is what we're sort of seeing that we can achieve. Here are the potential problems maybe for VFX and so forth. So we tried to be as inclusive and as forward-thinking as possible about what we will end up having to deal with on the day and how that could affect VFX later on as well.
They even created new puppetry devices to help the VFX team with really big issues that would have taken a ton of time in post-production to work on.
And in fact, an example of trying to be creative in a way that helps with like the VFX budget actually was not so much to do with Bobby, but to do with another character, and a character I puppeteered, and that was Maya Monkey, who was played by Amy Donald, you know, the Megan stunt double. So that's the second of 3 characters that we've co-performed together. So originally I started out puppeteering Maya's tail with rods, 2 rods attached to her tail, and me in a blue screen suit. And so I'd be on set with her, moving her tail. And VFX, it was just like an absolute nightmare for everybody. It was a nightmare for blocking because there was so much foliage everywhere. It was a nightmare for camera placement, and then VFX particularly were just like, okay, where can we put Paul? Do we need her tail moving at all in this scene? Can we just get rid of the rods, just have her tail just hanging down? And it was just constantly this thing of having to negotiate how to put me in the space with her, or in a way that kept the workload of VFX down. But there were times where I had to be right there next to her to make the movement work because of the action. And then our head of mechanical puppetry effects at the studios, Grant Lehman, who did Gus's ear puppetry, he came up with an animatronic tail about halfway through shooting. Animatronic tail that was just capable of some very fluid movement, but wasn't dexterous, wasn't prehensile. And when he came up with that, and then the first time he took it onto set and hooked up Amy with it and then tested out, everyone was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because so expressive. It was brilliant. You could have the tip of it, grab your finger and pull it tight, because the tension, once it had something, even something small, it would grip it super tight. It was a strong tail. Or it could take a bigger object and wrap around it, or you could move it so that it would hug somebody around the shoulders. But the best thing was that I didn't have to get into a gray suit. I could be 50 feet away from her and puppeteer her. I could be way away, and nowhere near. And the only thing was just the noise of the servos, because they're quite noisy. And so every now and again, sound would be like, does the tail need to be on in the shot? Because we can't hear dialogue.
Now, while puppetry might sound like all fun and games, it can actually be pretty taxing and take a big physical toll to perform, as you have to contort your body into various positions to make things work.
One of the directors actually not only had Bobby to deal with, Carol Banker, she also had Peter the crocodile as well, who was a mixture of a creature suit performer and myself, and also Laura Trundle coming in to puppeteer an insert head, which was snapping jaws. I actually injured myself puppeteering that head. I sprained my ribs, because what happened was they needed to get shots of Peter running along the ground, snapping his jaws at Gus and Dr. Singh as they're running away. And so we put me on a dolly with the puppet head, and I extended the jaws out in front of me and was just like snapping, snapping, snapping. We did it numerous times, me being pushed on the dolly and I'm holding the jaws out, snap, snap, snap. It was like super fun, but I was lying on about 10 mil thick foam, EVA foam, on top of this dolly cart and rolling side to side. And at one point, Carol Banker, the director, she said, Paul, are you okay on lying on that? She said, I'm a little bit concerned that that's not padded enough for you. Because all I was wearing was my grey screen suit. I had no padding other than my clothes underneath. And I was like, I'm fine. She's like, because we're just going to do one more take. I was like, I'm fine. It's been great. No problem. She goes, okay, so for this next take, could you please just roll the head a little bit more? We just want to get a little bit more of a side-to-side action as you're doing the chomp. I was like, I'm on it. And so we do the next take, and just as we get to the end, I roll onto my right side a little too hard, and I felt something go pop or something like that. And I was like, oh no, because I've fractured ribs in the past. I was like, oh no. And cut was yelled, and I stood up and I went, oh no, because I couldn't breathe properly. I was really, really super sore. And so I was like, and everyone was like, what, are you okay? And I was like, just give me a second. I just want to see something. So I lay down on the cart again because they were going to go one more take. And I was like, oh yeah, that's not happening. And so I thought I'd fractured my ribs. And luckily Laura was there because, essentially it's a one-person puppet. But we brought in Laura just to have as a backup. And so thank God she was there, because I was able to say, and this is like a third of the way through the day. And we had a whole day of shooting Peter to go with stunt stuff to do with him chomping on the leg of one of the last men. And I was like, Laura, this is going to have to be you for the rest of the day. And she's like, I'm on it. I got it. And then once we wrapped for the day, I was on painkillers, very strong painkillers. I went to hospital. And the doc didn't even x-ray me. He said, you've sprained your ribs. He said, you've sprained the soft part of your ribs, the part that's connected to the bone. He says, I see it as a sports injury in rugby players all the time. He said, we don't even need to x-ray. That's exactly what it is. He said, we can x-ray if you like. You sprained that part of your ribs. He said, it'll take 8 weeks to heal. So I spent the following 8 weeks, and we had still so much of season 2 to shoot, but it eventually faded away. But it made Puppeteering Bobby quite interesting. So, but I was back at work the next day. You learn to really just have that core absolutely engaged to be able to do, because you're totally contorted. I mean, to be able to, sometimes they're like, you know what, like with Megan I was contorted all the time. It was like, we can't have you in the shot at all. And so I'd have to figure out, how am I going to do this performance and not be seen and make this work? And it was just an ongoing challenge with Megan. Bobby, not so bad, because we would be in grey screen suits and we knew we could be painted out.
Throughout the first and second seasons of Sweet Tooth, the puppetry for one of the best puppets in the show, Bobby, continued to be improved upon by Paul Lewis and the team of Puppeteers.
So we had a couple of ways of doing it. So the most fluid way of performing him was Laura and I physically on the body, next to each other, me holding the head and the body, and then Laura on the arms. And the feet we wouldn't worry so much, because they were pretty much, he was pretty much always shot from the waist up when he was not moving, like walking around. I'd figured out in episode 1 how he would walk, that his legs would be moving quite fast, but his body would actually, it wouldn't bounce up and down. It would just be kind of like, be quite fluid. But we also had a walking rig. And on season 1, we had a version of the walking rig that required sometimes three puppeteers to perform Bobby physically, because we needed one on each hand. And then myself, I was in the walking rig, my feet attached to his feet, my body attached to his body, and I'd perform his head. And 3 people for that setup, where Bobby's moving through a space, means that 3 people have to be painted out. It means that we have to work on the performance together, but there's so much going on physically for all 3 of us, because it's a negotiation of the space that you're in and having to think about things that are in that space and how you work around them. And then the performance can get affected by that if there are rods connected to the arms and somebody's not quite in sync with the other 2 or whatever. I thought in the lead up to season 2, I had ongoing conversations with Grant Lemon, our HOD, and he was like, we should look at a way to have the walking rig be one that you can use just by yourself. And I said, that would be awesome, because I sort of have an idea in my head as to how we could make that work and the kinds of connections and stuff I wanted at various points. Because, like, for instance, one of the biggest things for me was moving the head. To move the head was just basically a rod was connected into the back of the head, and we bent it slightly for season 1, so there's a bit of a curve in it. But to move his head left to right meant a big sweep of the arm left to right, and same with up and down. And the rod would get in the way of the walking rig, or my arm would then sometimes come into shot, and they didn't want to have to deal with that being painted up. So I came up with an idea, which is not new, but when I thought of it, was like, I wonder if anybody else has done this, and it turns out that they had. Where basically the rod had a universal joint connected at the end of it that connected to the back of Bobby's head. So it became a push-pull. So if I pushed the rod to the base of the rod to the left, Bobby's head would turn right, but the movement would be absolutely tiny. So instead of a big swinging movement to make his head turn right, I was just pushing the rod. And then same for bringing his head round to the left, and same with up and down. It was just like push, pull. And so it was tiny movements of the wrist instead. Sometimes I had to swing my arm a little bit, but it wasn't as big as on the first rig. And so it was great. So when I tried on the walking rig, the season 2 walking rig, I was suddenly able to do all this movement by myself. And that became important later on when we did one shot with him walking through a very narrow space, and there's no way we could have had, because he needed to kind of be like gesturing a little bit with his arms. We couldn't have done that with another puppeteer in the shot. It was absolutely impossible, because it was a bus with seats filled with hybrid kids, and even though they did a clean background plate anyway to be able to paint me and the rods and stuff out, a puppeteer would have had to been climbing over the seats to keep up with me to do the arm. It wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked at all. But I was able to do the whole thing by myself. And that shot is there in season 2 of him walking down the bus. That's me with the walking rig.
Puppeteering is no joke and can add a considerable amount of value to any production. If you're a little more interested in puppetry now, you should definitely check out this video we did on puppeteering behind the movie Megan, right here.